explained beautifully what laughter is and how it happens, but why do we do it?
Yeah.
Why would such a thing evolve?
Yeah. It is hard. There's for Darwin, there's a rather thin, speaking of evolution, there's a rather thin line between laughing and being afraid. You know, it's not obvious when some animals are, as it were, smiling, or when they're baring their teeth in aggression or fear. So I'm not quite sure about its evolutionary function, but it's. I think the thing is, the thing about it is that it's a kind of dysfunctionality, if you like, is the way I presented it. It's when things momentarily break down or clash, but it's not really. It's not really a useful dysfunctionality any more than art is. I mean, in a sense, there's no point to a joke. There can be a point to a joke. Of course, joke can be used aggressively, or indeed used simply to communicate. But Freud makes a distinction between what he calls jokes and jests. And jests are really for him just bits of wordplay which have no point beyond themselves. There's something, what Seamus Heaney once talked about poetry as mouth music, yes. Poetry, the poets are people who are so infantile that they can't invest in the external world, but they invest, in the very organs of speech themselves, yes. And that becomes an end in itself, as it were. And there's a kind of jesting, joking, which I think is that sort of thing. But otherwise, it serves a whole lot of social function, doesn't it? From, as I say, from aggression and wounding. Satire is very important, sarcasm, which literally means tearing the flesh, to establishing community, but often for its own sake. I have, again, in the book I talk about the history of humour and the politics of humour, and how humour can be instrumental to a kind of enlightenment, but it can also be, as it were, done just for the hell of it. Like most valuable things, it's done just for the hell of it. Yeah, it doesn't really have a point beyond itself.
Hi, I was interested in what you said about the historically having been kind of mass breakouts of laughter that people have died in. Are those apocryphal stories, or are they thought
so.
to be true?
I don't think so. I mean, some of them might be, but I think it is true that people have died laughing. And of course, what's interesting about that is the contagiousness of laughter, isn't it? That one of the ways in which laughter spreads, but not always very positively, is by a kind of contagiousness, like a disease. You're like some diseases, you don't know where you got them from, you don't know how it came to you. It supposedly is true, yes. So that that's one sense in which laughter is. I mean, we speak of hysterical laughter, don't we? Where laughter is very close to being extremely alarming, and where again the line between fear or aggression and enjoyment is blurred, but we don't know.
Could you say something about the tradition of jokes which are only very, very slightly funny?
Well, my jokes are so hilarious that I really don't know anything about that. I do believe there are jokes that aren't funny.
Or alternatively, could you tell a couple more jokes, please?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I suppose there must be some in here somewhere. Well, I mean, there are degrees of success in humour, aren't there, as there are in art or any form of communication. Humour is not guaranteed and is notoriously culturally relative. Yes. For example, on one of my first visits to China, I was told that to be on my guard when people started smiling, because it meant embarrassment, that they were embarrassed. And indeed, there was a famous occasion when I managed to embarrass them very much. What counts as funny varies both from a culture to another, one culture to another, and of course historically as well. Yes, I mean a lot of jokes from the past now to us seem gloriously unfunny. There is a history of laughter, however, which again I talk about in the book, which I think in literature starts with the Iliad. Somebody laughs in the Iliad. And there's also, of course, a biblical history of laughter. For example, God laughing sadistically at people in hell is one of the less Christian examples there. So that tradition of snarling or sardonic laughter is not simply confined to the devils, to the demons. Yes, there's a kind of sacred history there as well. There's a lady here. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could say something about laughter as a form of triumph, as in when the evil villain is about to dispatch the hero
Yes.
and gives a sinister laugh.
Yes.
And also, would your book help my partner's stand-up career?
Help your partners.
Stand-up career.
Oh, absolutely. It would be the making of it. But since I intend to have one myself, well, I already do really. But yes, triumphant laughter. Well, there are different forms of triumphant laughter, aren't there? Triumphant laughter is one of the many forms of laughter which are not particularly something funny. You don't always laugh at something funny. Yes. One of the puzzles also is that not all incongruities are funny. One of the defects of the incongruity theory of laughter, which covers more apparently than most theories, is that there are incongruities which are really not particularly funny at all, either neutral or positively unpleasant. So triumphalistic laughter, yes, laughter, either laughter as exuberance because you've conquered or you've succeeded, or of course the great German Schadenfreude, yes, laughing at somebody else's disability or somebody else's pain, which is a classic example of the superiority theory of laughter, which is, I mean, there may be an element of sadism in a lot of laughter, even apparently innocent laughter, or even masochism, but triumph can take various forms. It can take, for example, the form of stage comedy. We laugh at stage comedy, even at upsets and pratfalls and dislocations and potentially lethal events, because we know that everything will be restored in the end. It's a very comforting form of fantasy. In the end there will be, what's the basic rhythm of a narrative? You start with a kind of situation, it becomes disintegrated, something happens, somebody goes on the road or somebody comes along, then you have a process of disintegration, and then you have a triumphant restoration. The end, although in Shakespeare, notably, you very often have a character who stands aside from Malvolio, say at the end of Twelfth Night, I'll be revenged on the pack of you, who stands aside from the final synthesis in order to gesture to its unreality. Yeah? Or when Prospero says, please release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. He means applaud. Applaud, why? Because then you will recognize that this is a fiction. Yes? And then the spell of fantasy will be broken, and you'll be able to leave the theatre and take with you whatever you've learnt from the play. So one of the alarming points, however, about comedy, is that you may conclude that poetic justice is now only possible in fiction. I mean, if you look at somebody like, say, Tom Jones in the 18th century, or any of those comic heroes or heroines, it's pretty likely they would in reality have been hanged, or put in prison. What does it say about a certain kind of society if the only form of justice you can dispense, even handedly, now requires the artifice of fiction? Yeah, so that fiction, the artifice of fiction, no longer reflects the actual world as it does when the comic is related to the cosmic. Yes, I mean, Dante's Divine Comedy is called a comedy because, as you will know, there are not very many giggles in it, on the whole. But of course, it's comedy in that different sense that the world itself is a kind of artifact, and that despite all appearances, This is perhaps the deepest sense of comedy. Despite all appearances, all is well. It may not look like that, but it is. That's also, of course, partly a Christian message. Despite crucifixion, it's not quite the last word. Not quite the last word. But unless you face that, unless you confront the very worst, you can't transcend it. You can't transcend it. And tragedy, just to switch to that mode, is, I suppose, the mode in which we have to open ourselves to the real, to what is unspeakable and intolerable, in order to try and get beyond it. As somebody, Edgar, says in Lear, the worst is not so long as we can say this is the worst. So long as we can still articulate it, it's not the end. Yeah?
Hi.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder if you say something about political satire. Why doesn't it seem to work? We seem to have, particularly in our culture, a strong belief in its efficacy, but it seems to produce the opposite. If you look at Boris Johnson, who's been sort of mercilessly mocked, has been on Have I Got News for You, and yet his popularity seems to increase. And think of Peter Cook and his comment about all that Weimar satire didn't seem to do much good.
Yeah.
Just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes. Well, I mean, people quite like buffoons, don't they? Like Boris Johnson. As people have always liked clowns, partly because they can feel superior to them, but also because the clown is all licensed. The clown can transgress. Olivia in Twelfth Night says there's no harm in a licensed fool. I mean, as long as that's your job, a fool with a capital F, which certainly Boris Johnson is, then you're okay, because then people can, as it were, harmlessly indulge their own libidinal fears or pleasures, knowing that it's not really going to make any difference. And that's the sort of the point, really. You say, why doesn't it make a difference? Well, that's one reason, I think. It's not meant to make that kind of difference. I don't know. Satire gives itself very high pretensions to correct vice, to purge evil, to reform society. Think of Alexander Pope and so on. But has it ever really done that? I don't know. Certainly not by itself, I think. Certainly not by itself. But there is, I've got here, in the book, there's a chapter, there's an account of a play by an old friend of mine, Trevor Griffiths, the play Comedians. And in Comedians, I mean, this is very much, it is the play par excellence about the politics of humour, both how humour can degrade and humiliate, and how it can be emancipatory. Yeah, but the line is often pretty thin.
Your book sounds very erudite, but like a lot of analysis of humour, it seems to be fixated in the past a little. You quote Griffiths, you quote Wilde, Bob Monkhouse, but it seems to me certainly stand-up has moved on tremendously. It's long form, it's about attitude, it's about a comic persona, and people aren't laughing at sudden reversals, whether it be reversals of fortunes or expectations. They're laughing at something else.
Yes. Well, as I say, as somebody born in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, that's not the past to me. I mean, Wilde was, yes, of course humour changes, and you're right. The theory of sudden reversal and so on is not exhaustive by any means. You're quite correct. One interesting aspect of stand-up, among many, and the revival of that comic popular art form is tremendously important, I think, is that you can do a kind of meta humour, can't you? Stuart Lee. In fact, I'm supposed to be doing a gig with Stuart Lee in London. That double or treble take, which has always been, in a sense, there in the comic tradition, but has become a lot more important, partly because we've become much more knowing, haven't we? Yes, we're certain kinds of humour presuppose a certain kind of naivete, which is, in a streetwise postmodern society, won't work. Yeah.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.